From ticking all the boxes for a certified tearjerker to Karen Gillan describing it as the end of the era, let's dive into the details of Guardians Volume 3 moments that will reduce you to tears. But before I take off, have you ever wondered why films sometimes make you feel things so strongly? Well, there are two things at play. First up, we've got the artistry. This includes everything from the soundtrack to how scenes are crafted. Take, for example, the perky needle drops in the Guardians franchise, or Drax using his comedy chops just at the right moment. So is it all about how the cast and crew play their cards? Yes, but it's not all of them. Once a film's team has sent their brainchild into the world, according to psychologists, our brains then use a little something called oxytocin to make their well-crafted project stick. For anyone who failed science class, that's the love hormone, responsible for building emotions like trust and increasing our empathy. Simply put, it's what made us feel bad for Peter after he lost Gamora. Speaking of Gamora, it looks like your oxytocin will be working overtime during this installment because Guardians of the Galaxy 3 was by all means one of those tearful send-offs. For those of you who aren't caught up, the last time we saw our favorite space losers was in a Disney Christmas special. We saw how Mantis, someone who I believe has been an underdeveloped character in the MCU so far, and Star-Lord were actually half-siblings. This time around, however, the official synopsis had one of those into the unknown angles to it. Briefly, it teased how Quill, who is still nursing his wounds from losing Gamora, would, once again, have to rally his team, -1 around him, to defend the universe. I'll come to that -1 in a minute, but before that, it's also important to know how the official plot threatened the end of the Guardians as we know them, in case Quill were to fail. All I am saying is, emotions were at an all-time high even before the film came out. That said, let's talk about the -1, shall we? If you haven't guessed yet, I am talking about Rocket. Now, admit it or not, the film's narrative sights were set on him. And given the ending of Guardians 2 and how disturbed he was by Yondu's death, I don't see why it shouldn't have been Rocket's story. This mention of Yondu and Rocket reminds me that apart from the scene that I think will make you cry buckets, the deaths of Floor, Teefs, and Lilla really messed me up. Seeing Rocket, who we all know and love as a snarky and somewhat selfish character, wailing in grief at the death of his best friends, really made me look at him as a different raccoon. Probably because his cries were so childlike, conveying that before he became the single-minded character that we know him for, at one point in his life, he was only a child, unable to process the overwhelming emotions that come up when someone close to you tragically passes away. Now, add the 2 times that he died himself to the mix, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that he anchored the movie from beginning to end. So with this heart-wrenching scene out of the way, it's time we talked about the moment we've all been waiting for. As I said, the film was an emotional roller coaster through and through, and even though it may seem like it, Rocket wasn't the only one getting closure. All of our favorite misfits had their hearts broken and mended again. Regardless, if there's one moment that continues to make me break down in tears every time I think about it, it's the sight of Groot speaking English. Before we relive the trauma of this scene, how about we take a little trip down memory lane? Since we first met him, Groot has had a limited vocabulary, one that we've all gotten a kick out of several times in the franchise. Remember the time he met Steve? Now, while the captain failed to understand him, that's not the case with every character. In Avengers, Infinity War, Thor, who's taken Groot as an elective, can decipher what the tree-like creature says to him. As for this installment, all of the main characters, except for Gamora, who eventually learns as well, can speak Groot. Coming back to the scene in question, when Groot tells his friends, "I love you guys," there are 2 possible explanations for it. And before you ask, one of them is really emotional. How about we get it out of the way first? So it's basically a fan theory suggesting that he wasn't speaking English at all. Instead, after spending some 10-odd years with the character, fans were able to understand him like the rest of the characters. This not only means that Groot's "I love you" was directed at us as well, but also that we've officially been accepted into the ranks of the Guardians. And guess what? James actually confirmed this stylistic choice on Twitter. As far as I remember, while Groot is an Asgardian elective in non-Gunn universe, Gunn explained that it's not what it takes to understand the creature. If that were the case, Gamora could simply have enrolled in a course or something. Sadly, or luckily depending on how you see it, they don't offer electives called How to Deepen Your Relationship with Groot, which is what it actually takes to decipher him. Yes, It's not just about the physical time spent with the creature. See, I didn't come out of the theater emotionally scarred for nothing. There's something really moving about characters from different backgrounds coming together and trying to understand each other so deeply that they transcend the barriers of language. Now, when it comes to the second fan explanation, just a heads up, it's a bit disappointing, because it simply says that Groot was able to speak English in the comics. No offense, but that's kind of boring. Also, in case you're wondering why it wasn't possible for Groot to have really spoken English, especially since the English-speaking Guardians are always around him. Well, think about it. Ever since he sacrificed himself, we all know that he's not the same character that we met in Volume 1. So, at the simplest, he hasn't spent enough time with them to learn it. This repeated mention of speaking English reminds me of another interesting detail that you should know about. Because, did you guys know that at the time that they were filming Guardians 2, James actually gave Groot's voice artist, Vin Diesel, an English translation of his script? Yes, you heard that right. Vin has always known what Groot was saying. I wonder if the other characters got a copy of his script this time around as well, or if they were improvising their reactions. Speaking of reactions, let's take a look at how the cast felt about this scene, and the film in general. To begin with, Karen Gillan, who reprised her role as Nebula, told Rolling Stone that there was a particular scene towards the end of the threequel that one could term an end-of-an-era scene. Now, I have every reason to believe that it was the Groot one, because what other moment would have all the actors crying real tears, or feel like a real goodbye? Similarly, in a 2022 interview with Empire, the Gamora actress, Zoe Saldana, also hinted at how the film had a beautiful conclusion. Apart from that, she also expressed how while she had complained about wearing green makeup all these years, she was finally nostalgic about it. As for Chris and the rest of the cast, they didn't really say anything about the scene itself. That said, in a 2023 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Pratt did talk about how our brain can't tell the difference between acting and not acting, and that after filming a difficult scene, of which there were plenty in the sequel, it's important that you compartmentalize your emotions. He said, and I quote, "You have to walk away from that, and it doesn't go away for a while until you do the work to put it back." In another interview with the same magazine, he explained how even though he eventually moves on from the people that he works with, he doesn't think that'll happen in the case of his Guardians co-stars. So I kind of see why That I Love You may have struck a chord. But of course, while the cast had their own reactions to the movie, let's talk about probably the most important guy on the team, James Gunn. Now, Gunn was also a part of the first interview that I referred to, and he talked about how the film was a communal thing. He took the time to thank his fellow creators for always having his back, and explained how happy all of them were at the idea of the film finally getting made. You and me both, James. You and me both. So from Karen Gillan calling it an end-of-an-era scene, to it checking all the boxes for a real tearjerker, this was all about the heartbreaking Guardians, 3 moments that will make you cry.